The birth of the Firebee harkens back to not long after World War II. In 1948, the Air Force's pilotless aircraft branch sought to develop a jet-powered aerial target, which would travel at subsonic speeds to test ground-to-air and air-to-air weaponry.
The target can be launched from zero-length launchers, which are either stationary, mobile, or at sea. In these launch modes, Firebee engine thrust is augmented by a solid propellant rocket motor, which burns for 2.2 seconds before dropping away.
Ryan Aeronautical Company of San Diego, California, won the design competition in August of 1948. 2 years later, the Air Force, Army, and Navy then jointly developed the Firebee BQM-34 project. The Royal Canadian Air Force would eventually purchase drones as well, some for Arctic cold weather missile evaluation. The publication Jane's Pocketbook of Remotely Piloted Vehicles, Aircraft Today, documented that the first flight, called the XQ-2 X for Experimental, took place in the summer of 1951. At 21 feet 11 inches long, with a wingspan of 12 feet 11 inches, the Firebee was used to train pilots who would intercept enemy aircraft. The Firebee was initially strictly a target, although later the Navy would test their model for self-described suicide missions.
A BQM modified by the U.S. Navy in a development program has been given the peculiar role of kamikaze-like destroyer. Shown here in Navy test footage, the SSM effectually impacts the target with its load of explosives.
Once launched, the Firebee could reach speeds of 690 miles per hour and climb 16,000 feet a minute to a ceiling of 60,000 feet. Like most new technology, sometimes success is not achieved on the first try. Unlike most targets, pilots did not have to hit the Firebee to produce data. A near miss was actually preferable. Firebees were expensive, and destroying them in practice wasn't the ultimate goal. In fact, a parachute recovery system allowed the Firebee to be snatched in midair for subsequent use. In 1954, the Firebee would be tested at Holloman Air Force Base, then Holloman Air Development Center in Alamogordo, New Mexico.
This is the Ryan Firebee, a jet-powered target drone which aids the Air Force in testing its air defense missiles. Its gross weight is less than a ton, and it is carried aloft by a B-26 mothership. This diminutive jet plane is powered by a 1,000-pound thrust engine which weighs only 350 pounds. 600 pounds of fuel give it an endurance of 1 hour at 40,000 feet altitude, as it is controlled by radio commands from the ground. An F-102 Delta Dagger is being armed with Falcon guided aircraft rockets. In a few moments, it will intercept the Firebee in a test of its own fire control system. As the Firebee is carried toward the Air Force Missile Development Center range, the ground controller gets ready to take over. The F-102 with Falcons aboard heads for target practice. The drone is now on its own, and radar at the control site plots its course. Time now for the intercept as the drone climbs higher and nears its maximum speed of 620 miles per hour. the F-102's fire control system performs as planned. The drone, unharmed by a purposely planned near miss of the Falcons, is recovered to fly another test mission. In fact, one Firebee flew 19 such missions before it became unairworthy. From inaccessible sections of the range, used jointly by the Air Force and the Army, the Firebee gets a ride back to the shops to be made ready for the next contribution to the development and test of Air Force missiles.
A good portion of test missions were targets for the Air Intercept Missile, or AIM-4s, 7s, and 9s, more commonly known as the Falcon. The results were considered so successful that the Air Force announced regular production of Firebees would begin. In 1958, during William Tell at Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, the Firebee's capabilities were put on display. What's been colloquially termed a shoot-'em-up for Air Force Defense Command, the war games-type atmosphere pits pilots and planes against targets mimicking enemy aircraft.
The Firebee carrier moves out and takes to the air, heading for the release point over the Gulf of Mexico, miles from the Florida shoreline. And it's away, to be ground control flown along the attack course until intercepted and destroyed or recovered by internal parachute after fuel burnout. Not merely a jet speed drone to the pilots who will seek and destroy it, but a potential enemy aimed for cities and defense areas. From this point, it isn't a game. The critical moment has arrived. Ground control radar spots the bogey, and the attack is on. The F-102 squadrons were the only competing teams awarded the maximum points allowable for getting teams airborne, 300 points per mission. The F-102s scrambled. The aircraft are vectored to target by GCI. Ground controllers for each team were highly skilled and contributed to the outstanding kill scores in the meet. When he has made radar contact, he switches control to the MG-10 fire control system. With radar locked on, he moves in on the enemy for the kill. Here is the attack run as seen by the pilot. One bogey. On these missions, the high level of electronic reliability of the fire control system and the number of direct hits on the target were convincing proof of the efficiency of the F-102 weapon system.
The Firebee Model H was tested under a project called HEMP, or H, Evasive Maneuver Program.
HEMP, designed by Ryan and Melpar Corporation, is intended to give the H the ability to evade high altitude. After extensive flight tests at the Pacific Missile Range, Point Mugu, California, the H was ready for delivery in December 1966. All special purpose aircraft, once qualified, are delivered initially to the 100th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. Here they are operationally tested and repackaged for final shipment to Operating Location 20. This 147H will be transported non-stop to Vietnam on a C-141 Starlifter.
The Firebee evolved for many other purposes as well, and was eventually equipped to achieve supersonic speeds. Among the different purposes during the Vietnam War, Firebees flew photographic reconnaissance.
Some of the most remarkable contributions to aerial reconnaissance during the Vietnam War came from an unusual assortment of remotely piloted vehicles, or RPVs. The primary RPV of the war was the Ryan Firebee drone, otherwise known as the Lightning Bug. The Firebee was essentially a jet-powered aerial target vehicle that had been modified to carry cameras and a wide variety of other sensors. The drones were air-launched from Lockheed DC-130s. The remote control officer would then monitor and guide the RPV to its target area. Once the intelligence had been gathered, the drone was guided back into friendly airspace. At a designated location and time, the drone shut off its engine and deployed a parachute system that allowed the crew of a Sikorsky CH-3 or CH-53 helicopter to retrieve it in midair. The recovery phase of RPV missions was by far the most hazardous. Crews often wondered who was actually catching whom when they finally hooked on to a falling 3,000-pound drone. Over the course of 11 years, more than 3,400 drones were launched on missions over North Vietnam, China, and North Korea. Among their many achievements, the RPVs have been credited with capturing the first photographic evidence of SAM deployments in North Vietnam, the first pictures of SAMs actually detonating, and the first in-flight photos of the North Vietnamese MiG-21. While more than 200 drones were ultimately shot down, their use prevented the loss of at least that many reconnaissance crews, and undoubtedly many more.
Tests in the early 1970s were undertaken to see if the craft could deliver ordnance, including launching heat-seeking missiles, which led to technology put to use in Afghanistan. In 1971, the Air Force launched what was then described as a new pilotless jet warplane able to launch guided smart bombs at enemy targets, according to a report in a California newspaper. This evolved Firebee was placed under the wings of the Defense Department's new RPV program, or Remotely Piloted Vehicles. Today, RPVs are commonplace above the battlefield. The Firebee was a valued part of the American military inventory over a 5-decade period. Various documents state the drone has flown more than 10,000 missions. The New Mexico Museum of Space History some years back restored a Firebee. It's now in the museum support center.